Hey, welcome back. It's your boy Will J. Let's sit down and talk about shenanigans. Today we're going to be talking about something different, determining your deck's power. I thought about including this as an aside in my last Commander Deck Tech video, but as I was talking about it, I realized it probably merited its own video, so I can go a bit more in depth. That said, I do hope to include rating power levels of my brood decks in my future videos, so watch out for that. Or if you have time, check out the other broods I've already made. Now, the topic of power levels in Commander has been a tricky and almost sensitive topic for some. When you check online, there's no real consensus on how to definitively rate or determine what the power levels are. And while people have come up with some popular ones, like with many things, it comes with its huge share of detractors and naysayers. What about this scenario? Or what if my deck's like that? Some would even argue, why do you even need power levels at all? Among established playgroups or regular LGS patrons, I see their point. These things are likely to self-regulate and self-correct themselves over time. It doesn't matter how good of a Rule Zero speech you have prepared, playing the game beats talking about the game any day. And also, if you're a longtime Commander player and you're listening to this, you probably don't realize that you already have thousands of cards involuntarily stored away in your memory bank, along with the lyrics to a bunch of Backstreet Boys songs you just seem to know for some reason. And so you have an inherent advantage in gauging decks just from pure experience. But among strangers or newer players, this just gets harder. Even for returning players actually, because maybe you only know the cards from the most recent sets, or from really old sets, or maybe you know the staples but you haven't yet experienced how degenerate or how oppressive some decks can get. And some type of system like power levels can help bridge that. And lastly, and here's me being frank, people just like rating things, even if it's just for fun. It's why we want to know who the S-class heroes in One Punch Man are, or who the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe are among the Avengers. We have debates over who's the GOAT or the greatest of all time in whatever sport you follow. And so in the same vein, people want to rate their decks. Nothing wrong with that. And so today, I'm not expecting to make miracles. I don't think I'll be able to come up with a perfect power level system that'll solve all the debates. Instead, I'm gonna share with you guys a system that I think works for us, for our purposes, here on this channel. I know it's not as catchy, but hopefully you'll like and appreciate it, and you leaving a like and a subscribe would be something I'd really appreciate as well. So thanks in advance for that, and for letting me just speak about my passion, my geekdom, and what'll likely be another content creator speaking too much about stuff that they think too much about. So here we go. Before I get into the power level system we'll be using on this channel, I'll talk a little bit about what is probably the most popular one out there, and this is the 1 to 10 scale. This scale categorizes decks from 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. At the top of the list, these decks are described as Tier 1 and Tier 2 CEDH decks. CEDH is an acronym that stands for Competitive EDH or Competitive Commander. These decks will try to win in the most optimal way they can, and while it's probably a misconception that CEDH games end in the first couple of turns, they do run some of the most powerful and efficient cards in the format. No space for cards with fun names like River Hoopo and Hypno Rivulet. Sorry, I just like saying those cards. Then at the bottom of the list, this scale describes these decks as what's a win con and a random pile of cards. Kinda harsh descriptions if you ask me, and I think it really disincentivizes players from ranking their decks this low, because who wants to call their deck a random pile of cards, especially if it's something that they spent time on and some money. Anyway, I'll post a link of the image in the description below if you want to read the full write-ups, because they are quite detailed, but in general, you will encounter a lot of people gravitating towards 9 to 10 when they identify as CEDH, and then 6 to 8 when they're not. If you've ever heard the term, my deck's a 7, whether sarcastically or earnestly, this is probably what they're alluding to. Now for our purposes, we're gonna take inspiration from some other games, sports, and even Magic's very own creatures. And that is, we're gonna represent the duality of offense and defense, or proactiveness and reactiveness, or power and toughness. I mean, you get the picture. Then, we'll map these out on a matrix that'll roughly tell us where our deck fits in. The most powerful decks are gonna be terrific at both, and the weakest decks aren't gonna be particularly good at either one. So let's go into a bit of detail for each one. Offense or proactiveness of a deck for me is about what is the most badass thing your deck can pull off with 10 mana, 15 mana, infinite mana, right? How well does the deck do in moving its game plan towards ending the game? At turn 0, decks, no matter how they're made, are always going to have some type of way to end the game. Whether in a win, a draw, a loss by killing themselves, even if you're just trying to survive 93 turns as you watch your opponent slowly deck themselves, the game will end. And so when I look for offense, I'm looking for these 3 keys. The first is how efficiently or how quickly the deck is usually going to be able to assemble the necessary pieces to create a game-ending state. So whether that's a 2-card combo, flooding the board, or death by 1,000 cuts, more efficient decks are gonna have a higher offensive rating. This is why in my usual brews, I bring up ramp as one of the usual themes because ramp advances our game plan to do the more powerful things sooner. The sooner you can ramp, the more powerful the deck generally becomes. However, while accelerating our game plan makes our deck more powerful, it isn't the only thing. Consistency is the next thing I consider, meaning what are the odds that we're gonna be able to assemble those pieces that create our game-ending state. Commander is a singleton format with 99 cards in a deck, and so 1 mana crypt doesn't vault our power level into the stratosphere. Sure, we might occasionally get that explosive early start, which might make other people think your deck is stronger than it actually is, but play 2 games in a row and odds are it won't perform the same. One way the consistency of a deck increases is if there are redundancies, like if beyond the mana crypt, we also run Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Jeweled Lotus, Lotus Petal, etc. These increase the odds of us drawing into these types of effects, and so the more quote-unquote copies there are of a mechanic, the more consistent the deck becomes. Another way is through tutors. Tutors are usually the type of cards people think of when they hear consistency, and it's easy to see why. They're generally able to fish out the card you need from your deck. But even other forms of card advantage like drawing cards or getting cards in the graveyard or scrying, these all help us dig and, in varying degrees, increase the consistency of our deck. And again, this is also why I have draw as one of our usual themes whenever I brew a deck with you guys. But even if a deck is efficient and really consistent in assembling its game plan, there's still one more dimension I consider when rating a deck's offense, and that is the quality of our win cons. How do we plan on ending the game? Commander is often played in a 4-player setting, and so having the potential to kill the entire table or outright win the game is generally more powerful than getting rid of 1 player at a time. Not to say that killing 1 player at a time is not viable, it is, but taking care of only 1 player means we give the other players a chance to kill us, or win the game before the turn cycle returns to our untap step. Killing the table in 1 turn is also generally more powerful than killing a table over multiple turns, like say through dealing incremental damage once per turn cycle. These 3 aspects are what I'll be considering when I rate our future decks' proactiveness or offensive firepower, and honestly I think they're all fairly equal in weight. This is why players who are running decks with supposedly bad cards or bad win cons, but they still supplement it with high-powered support cards to make it more efficient, and they have strong draw engines / tutors to give it consistency, they still do well even in a fairly high-power casual table. And the opposite is true too. I'm not really a combo player, but I know infinite combos sometimes get a bad rap. But if the combo deck isn't that efficient, or if it isn't that consistent, it doesn't automatically make it CEDH. But let's set aside offense for now, and let's look at the other side of the coin, defense. Defense, or the reactiveness of a deck, for me, is all about how well the deck interacts and stops the other players from ending the game on their terms. However, unlike offense, not every deck will have defense built in. Are those decks good? Well, when I show the matrix later, I'll show you guys how it all shakes out. But when I look for defense, I'm also looking at 3 keys. The first is how efficiently or how much resources our deck needs to commit to be able to react to threats, whether on the stack or on the board. When I talk about resources here, I'm talking fairly holistically. Mana is likely everyone's top of mind, and true, that is a valuable resource. But also, we should consider other things, such as time, as in how much of your turn or how many turns did you spend answering a threat or threats. For example, if your average Commander game ends in about 7 to 10 turn cycles, and you spend the entirety of 2 of your turns playing a 6-drop wipe, or holding up mana because you're looking to counter something, that also means you only have about 5 turns left moving your game plan forward. Another resource is the number of cards, meaning how many cards are you using up to be able to answer threats. While sorceries and instants are usually what we think of when we think of interaction or removal, these can be expensive because we're up against multiple opponents. Having permanents that can constantly deal with threats can be more efficient because we're spending less cards to do so. Stacks pieces or hate cards can be an efficient way to play defense because you front load the cost once, and as a result you're able to buy yourself time or you stop an opponent preemptively. In general, the less resources a deck needs to commit to react, the stronger a defense it has. But much like running just 1 mana crypt, defense isn't just about having 1 efficient reactive card in our deck. Consistency is also a factor I consider in evaluating defense, meaning at any given moment, what are the odds that we will have an answer to a threat? And again, we can luck out and have that lone Swords to Plowshares right when we need it, but if it's the lone removal spell, we likely aren't going to be able to have access to it in the next game. And so, like offense, one way to increase the defensive power of our deck will be to run redundancies, to increase the chances of us having an answer at the ready. The more wipes, targeted removal, counter spells, theft spells, graveyard hate, stacks pieces, and things like this you run, the stronger of a defensive shell you'll have. Unlike offense though, I don't really consider tutors as contributing much to defense because tutors are usually used proactively. Not to say it never happens, but really, it's mainly the volume of cards you're dedicating towards interaction that add to defense. And also, well, your commander. A commander is sometimes already inherently defensive or has strong defensive potential, which helps with the consistency of the deck. Now lastly, the third dimension I consider when rating a deck's defense is its coverage. By coverage, I mean how many zones and types of permanents is our deck able to interact with. The board is scary, triggers on the stack are scary, abilities are scary, the graveyard is scary, artifacts and enchantments are scary. Everything in Commander can be a problem. And so how suited is our deck in dealing with different scenarios? This is largely driven by the color pie, where some colors are better at interacting with certain elements of the game than others. Like for example, blue has the most options when reacting to the stack, as opposed to say a color like green. However, green has no problem dealing with enchantments, while red would have some pretty limited options. This is all part of the game as some colors are designed to be stronger defensive colors than others, and so running multiple colors can increase our deck's coverage. This list I wrote down is generally what I find the different colors are good at interacting with. Sure, there's the occasional color pie break and also colorless options, but the colorless ones are usually overcosted, which will hit our efficiency. Not to say that you're doomed if you're running only 1 to 2 colors, but sometimes when you're playing Rakdos and someone's playing Enchantress, the best removal becomes player removal. With all of that explained, let's put it all together. For upcoming videos, I plan to show a grid where we can plot our Brood deck's estimated power levels when it comes to offense and defense. And as I promised earlier, let's walk through first what deck archetypes we can find when we plot them against this matrix. I tried my best color coding this grid. Not the smoothest gradient, I know, but I tried. And this is how, in my opinion, I think power levels slot in. In the common lingo with 9 to 10s in the deep red, 7 to 8s in the oranges, and so on. On the bottom left with a lower rated offensive and defensive power rating, we have the jank decks. Are these decks weak? Well, traditionally speaking, yes. But they are also likely wanting to do something beautiful other than try to win effectively. For example, I made a jank deck before, where I made a better love story than Twilight black-green deck centered around Liliana and Garruk. My card choices in the deck centered around having Liliana and or Garruk in the artwork, the name, or the flavor text. Did it win? Not really, but it was a work of art, or at least I thought so. On the top left, with a high-powered offense but limited defense, we have glass cannon decks. They turbo out to try and win as fast as possible, ending the game as fast as possible, but will also allow their opponents to advance their game plan as well. Low defense doesn't mean zero interaction, but it means you likely won't have an answer when you need it, and it only reacts to limited permanent types and zones. But who needs answers when the game is over? On the other extreme at the top right are decks with a high-powered offense and defense. These are essentially competitive stacks decks that seek to lock down the board and prevent other players from playing the game, while also packing their own powerful win cons that can end the game on the spot. Not saying these are the most powerful decks you can ever build, but they do rate favorably on paper. And don't feel pressured to build these decks because the playstyle just isn't for everyone. Lastly, on the bottom right corner are decks with really strong defense but low-powered offense. While not particularly competitive, they can be oppressive. An example here can be chaos decks that like to make chaos for the sake of chaos, but they have a hard time finding ways to close out the game. So this is a view on power level. However, for our purposes, I made another color-coded grid. And if you're not familiar with who we are, we're a channel focused on casual brews built around table interaction, card synergy, and winning the game, but hopefully more importantly, winning over friends. Overlaying the tags from our power level matrix, you can see some slight differences, particularly on the bottom right side. From general observation, strong defensive shells are more likely to make people salty even if your deck isn't quote-unquote particularly powerful. Actually, it might make play experience even worse if the game extends like 3 to 6 hours because no deck is powerful enough to break through the lock, but at the same time, the oppressive deck isn't strong enough to close out the game either. This is why even at A-level defense, decks with low offensive ratings get that borderline casual rating, meaning you should probably give people a heads up on what they're in for. The context changes though when strong defensive decks have higher offensive ratings, because they have more of an ability to close the game out. And at higher power levels, other high-power decks stand more of a chance at overcoming strong defenses to still make a game of it. And our brews will likely land in the low to high power regions, maybe the borderline regions, but highly unlikely in the red zones. But I'm keeping them all in this view just in case this graph is something you want to refer to. I'll just put our logo here real quick, and now you can screenshot and share with your friends and talk about how much you disagree or agree with me. And that's it for this episode. Phew! That was a mouthful. If you're still watching, thanks for listening to me and letting me ramble on. I originally made a rubric for this video to try and illustrate how we can more precisely measure offenses and defenses, but in the end, I didn't include it. 1, because it would make this video even longer, and 2, well, measuring power levels is already an inherently imprecise art. Hopefully you found this interesting though. I normally make deck tech videos which you might be seeing suggested on your screen right now, but if you like or hate this type of content from me, or if you've had thoughts on power levels, let me know about it in the comments. I hope to see you in my next video, and until then, stay inspired and have a great day.